to football's golden oldies from the Toll House in Lancaster. James Patrick Murphy. Jimmy was born in Tonpentra, Glamorgan on August 8, 1910. Jimmy's mother was a widow with 6 children when she married Billy Murphy for the second time. That very Irish name was like putting a red rag to a bull in the Rhondda Valley, and Jimmy learned to fight early in his life. As a youth, he played for various boys' teams and in 1924 represented Wales in a schoolboy international against England in Cardiff. He turned professional in 1928 when he joined West Bromwich Albion as a 17-year-old. He became a regular in the Albion side from 1931 to 2 and to 1934 to 35, making 149 appearances. In 1934-35, Jimmy helped Albion to reach the FA Cup final, which they lost 4-2 to Sheffield Wednesday. After 204 appearances for the Baggies, he moved to Swindon Town in 1939, but World War II intervened, curtailing his Swindon career to just 4 games. During the 1930s, Jimmy made 15 appearances for Wales. How he came to Manchester. World War II had ended his playing career and Sergeant Murphy served in the Far East, then North Africa, with the Royal Artillery as one of Monty's desert rats for 4 years before fighting in Italy. One boiling hot afternoon in 1945 in Bari, Italy, Murphy was addressing a crowd of servicemen, and his talk was full of fire and brimstone, mixed with a little comedy and elaborate hand gestures, and they were enthralled by his brilliant and fascinating speech, for which he received a tremendous ovation. On the fringe, listening intently, was Matt Busby, an old footballing friend and rival who was absolutely captivated and totally absorbed. Matt walked over to Jimmy and said, "I'm taking the manager's job at Manchester United, and there is a job waiting for you as my assistant when we get demobbed." Later, Matt said, "Jimmy was the first and the best signing I ever made for Manchester United." The stalwarts of the Manchester United backroom staff. These men included the legendary Lewis Rocker, 1882 to 1950, administrator, scout, assistant manager, who played a pivotal role in the development of the club. He had several roles in the club from the 1890s, T-boy, reserve team player, and as the fixer, was responsible for the signing of Matt Busby in 1945. Bert Wally, a centre-half who had been with United since 1934 until a serious eye injury in 1947-8 ended his career, and then he assisted Jimmy Murphy. Tom, Tosha Curry and Bill Inglis also joined the club in 1934. Arthur Powell, Joe Travis, Bert Fishburne and genial Joe Armstrong all worked with Murphy, who was the chief coach. These men were the heart and soul of Manchester United, who would carry the club to heights that could only happen in dreams. A typical Murphy day. A typical Murphy day would see him rise early, make the fire, a cup of tea for himself and his wife, and breakfast for the children, before saying his goodbyes. He caught the train into the city centre and then went to Old Trafford or the Cliff training ground, but on the way he attended morning mass and picked up his 60 cigarettes from the corner shop. Once at work, he would attend to the Mail, read match and scouting reports before discussing games and training with his assistants over cups of tea. Ideas and theories would be planned and discussed and coaching sessions set out. Once the players were in their training gear, Jimmy and his team would be out on the pitch working with the lads. Tom Curry and Bill English were first team trainers. Arthur Powell, another loyal servant, was in charge of the ground staff lads and would set out their duties. Players would rib the trainers mercilessly, but it never bothered them in the slightest, and there was no sort of backbiting or jealousy from any of the training staff, as Jimmy and Matt fostered a close family atmosphere. You will not find any record of staff dismissals at Old Trafford from the moment Matt Busby took control. Building the club from the bottom upwards, Busby and Murphy also recruited a select band of landladies from neighbouring areas where they could safely place youngsters signed from outside Manchester. It was Jimmy who decided which players were ready for promotion into the reserves and the first team, while each coach had a responsibility for the young fledglings in their care, and no swearing was allowed and discipline was taught. Jimmy worked at least a 12-hour day, 7 days a week, 84 hours minimum. At lunchtime he would eat his sandwiches in an old hut beneath the stands, which he called his office, with his pals Bert Woolley, Tom Curry, Bill English, Arthur Powell, Joe Travis and little Joe Armstrong, similar to the eventual boot room at Anfield. Even years later, when the club became one of the richest in the world and directors entertained people from the worlds of show business and politics, Jimmy very rarely ventured upstairs into the boardroom or the swanky restaurants. Jimmy said, "Those people talk a lot but say very little." From Desert Rat to Starmaker, he was always known as the Starmaker. This was the man who, more than Matt Busby, assembled and moulded the greatest array of soccer talent ever seen at one British club. To say that Jimmy Murphy was instrumental in laying the foundations of Manchester United is a gross understatement. It is said that Jimmy and his colleagues brought in 80% of the so-called Busby babes. Busby was comfortable speaking to the press. Murphy hated the spotlight, preferring to be out on the pitch in that famous baggy tracksuit. The photo shows Jimmy with the Welsh team wearing the famous baggy tracksuit that became his trademark. On his right is the magnificent John Charles. Before the Wales vs England game in October 1957, Jimmy gave his pre-match talk by going through the entire England team. At the end, Reg Davis said, "Jimmy, you haven't mentioned the man who is marking me, Duncan Edwards." Jimmy said, "Reg, my son, there will be a capacity crowd and the emergency services will be run off their feet with people fainting. So if you see Duncan coming towards you with the ball, just get out of his bloody way. No man on earth can stop him." At the end of the game, 4-0 to England, Reg exchanged shirts with Duncan and Dunk later signed him. Reg emigrated to Australia in 1971 but visited England again in the 1990s. I think he went to Manchester and donated the shirt to United's museum. Reg died in Perth. The ultimate teacher. Jimmy's contribution to Manchester United cannot be emphasised strongly enough. Matt Busby was a suave, silver-tongued architect who planned the building of a dynasty. But it was Jimmy Murphy who did the spade work, sowing the seeds of United's unprecedented youth policy. Jimmy was a brilliant man in many senses, but it was as a teacher-coach that his greatness shone through. Jimmy was a loyal articulate, intelligent and honest man, and more than Busby, he came to personify Manchester United's trademark style of play: honest, open, attack-minded and daring. Doesn't sound like the trademark style of play in 2024, does it? A trip to Paris changed Jimmy's outlook on how football should be played. Wales were in Paris to play France in May 1933, and the day before the game, Jimmy took a walk down to the Cologne Stadium to watch Jimmy Hogan, the lad from Nelson, conducting a coaching session. Jimmy had never seen anything like it. Hogan's teaching was based on the use of the ball, an object never seen in English football from one Saturday to the next. Murphy and Hogan struck up a close friendship, and Murphy saw that Hogan's teaching revolved around mastery of the ball. Murphy said, "I saw him, at 51 years of age, white-haired and fitter than men half his age, perform miracles of ball control. He could hit a target at 30 yards distance, 10 times out of 10. And whatever basic skill of ball control he was teaching, he could perform it to perfection." Murphy used Hogan's ideas when he joined Manchester United. Jimmy Hogan was born in Nelson in 1882 and died in Burnley in 1974, and he was never offered a post by the Football Association. Unlike the Austrian and Hungarian federations, Hogan believed in the 10,000-hour rule. It takes 10,000 hours of intensive practice to achieve mastery of complex skills, like playing the violin or playing football. He added another variable to this rule: you need an excellent teacher, and Jimmy Murphy certainly qualified as one of those. The beginning of Murphy's career at Manchester United. It wasn't all roses, far from it. In the spring of 1946, when a smiling, whistling Jimmy Murphy arrived at Old Trafford, he looked at the stadium and gasped at the sight before his eyes. It had been hit by German bombs and almost demolished. No facilities, grass on the terraces. It looked like a war zone, not a football stadium. None of this deterred the enthusiastic 35-year-old Murphy, who said, "We have no money and the players used an old Nissan hook for changing. The road ahead will be very hard." Busby and Manchester United were extremely fortunate because no man was better equipped for a fight than Jimmy Murphy, or Spud as he was always known in football circles. Manchester City's directors had kindly agreed to let them use Main Road until Old Trafford was renovated, and it was ready in August 1949. During those austere post-war years, United were a wonder to behold, swiftly establishing themselves as the most exciting team in the country, playing football to entertain. The great players in the team gave Busby and Murphy time to build for the future, but these basic facilities built up the camaraderie and team spirit that came to the fore later. Practically on United's doorstep stood the giant industrial centre of Trafford Park, where thousands commuted daily to work in the hundreds of factories belching thick smoke into the surrounding atmosphere from furnaces and coal fires. People were still living in slums and squalor, no hot water, electricity or toilets. Times were grim and deprivation appeared to be the norm in industrial Manchester. Great strides in the early years. United finished runners-up to Liverpool in 46-47, and pundits said they would have won the title, but were so busy playing attacking football to entertain vast crowds that they left gaps in defence. But Johnny Carey's side touched perfection when they won the 1948 FA Cup final against Blackpool, 4-2 in what is still described as the best ever final. United nearly won the double, finishing 1 point behind champions Arsenal. Jimmy said, "Thousands were watching us all over the country because we were so excited." Of course, the experts said that Busby and Murphy were fortunate to inherit these superb players, which was utter nonsense. In the 1930s, 9 seasons where United spent 6 years in Division 2, suffered 2 relegations from Division 1, had never won the top division since 1911 and finished 14th in Division 1 in 1939. So in 1946, Busby and Murphy inherited a team without a pedigree and needing a lot of hard work. Murphy and Busby were involved in all the training, and with volatile players like Rowley, Morris and a few others, tempers sometimes became frayed. But there was never any lingering resentment or grudges. They were building an exclusive club with team spirit. Jimmy said, "No matter how great players are, they still need moulding into a team." That is what the management team did with tremendous results between 1947 and 57. Second, fourth, second, first, 8th, 4th, 5th, first, then the tragedy of Munich. Once things at the club got established, Jimmy took charge of the reserves and the young players, although he was still involved with the first team. Onwards and upwards. For all his tireless efforts, Jimmy failed to produce any top-class youngsters in the early days, despite beavering away on the training field morning, noon and night. He was a little disappointed when young players he firmly believed would make the grade lacked that little spark that separates the great from the good. Despite his disappointment, Murphy never allowed it to change his optimistic view of the world, arriving at the club whistling and smiling every day. If any problems regarding the players cropped up, like drinking heavily or gambling, Jimmy would sort it out before it could get to Matt Busby. Jack Rowley said they were like mechanics building a car from scratch, and Jimmy was very, very good at getting on the field to coach and strike up a relationship with all the players. Nobody felt left out. In 1949, they returned to Old Trafford. We can see Jimmy and Matt surveying a refurbished Old Trafford in August 1949. Plus, at the bottom photograph, Jimmy with Bert Wally and little Joe Armstrong enjoying a laugh together, great friends. In their first season, the reserves won the Central League, but Matt and Jimmy knew there wasn't one player who could be brought into the first team, so they doubled their efforts to find their own youngsters and teach them the Manchester United way. After finishing runners-up in their first season, they held the same position in the following 2 seasons. 1952 saw them win the championship for the first time in 41 years, but the April cheers turned sour by October when they languished at the foot of the First Division. The team was growing old together and the fluency was gone. They finished in 8th place, the lowest in their time at the club, but they kept preaching the same message: give the ball to a red shirt, lads. Joe Armstrong and Bert Wally could spot future stars on a foggy day, said Jimmy. Football was about to see a revolution take place, and the dream was to create a world-class football empire where they could take lads straight from school. At the start of the 1950s, United signed a number of brilliant schoolboy prospects: Jackie Blanchflower, Mark Jones, Dennis Violet, Jeff Whitefoot, Eddie Lewis, Cliff Berkey, Jeff Benn, Albert Scanlon, John Doherty, and soon after Eddie Coleman, Duncan Edwards, Bobby Charlton, Ronnie Copes and Wilf McGuinness. In the glory years that followed, they were dubbed the Busby Bays, but might just as well have been called Murphy's Marvels or Wally's Wonders. In 1952, at a meeting of shareholders, Busby stunned his audience by saying there was no need to panic, as the club had talent worth over £200,000 and they would soon be writing a new and glorious chapter in the club's history. The search begins. The three musketeers, Jimmy, Bert Woolley and Joe Armstrong, travelled thousands of miles in their search to bring the right youngsters to Old Trafford, with Murphy preaching that there was no substitute for skill and character. Towards the end of 1952, Matt and Jimmy decided they needed a centre forward, as the home-reared ones weren't making progress. United reserves were playing Barnsley reserves in Yorkshire. United won the game, but a big, dark, curly-haired youngster scored a hat-trick and gave the defence a torrid time, especially goalkeeper Gordon Clay. Next morning, Jimmy said to Matt, "I found him. 6 foot tall, superb physique, fantastic in the air, bags of heart, and can run forever." Johnny Carey was sent to watch Tommy Taylor, and Matt was soon in Barnsley, paying them £1 short of £30,000, beating 16 other clubs. Matt didn't want to saddle Tommy with a £30,000 price tag, and what a bargain United got. In 189 games, he scored 128 goals. In 19 games for England, he notched 16 goals. What more can anyone ask from a centre forward? Matt gave the remaining £1 to the tea lady. Who is that man? It was a bitterly cold, bleak and dismal November morning in the early 1950s, and a party of overseas soccer enthusiasts were visiting the cliff, Man United's old training ground, watching Violet, Edwards, Pegg and the rest. But it was a muddy little fellow wearing the baggy tracksuit caked in mud who caught their eye, organising training like a musical conductor, full of vigour and enthusiasm, shouting instructions to the young professionals on the pitch. "Who is that man? He's brilliant," they asked their guide. The guide thought the visitors meant one of the players and asked, "Which one do you mean?" When the visitors pointed to the man organising the session, the guide smiled broadly and replied, "Oh, that's just Jimmy." The guide was right, of course, because Jimmy was always known to football insiders as the Starmaker. The greatest. Jimmy reckoned that Duncan Edwards was the greatest player he ever brought through at Manchester United, and the two had a fantastic relationship. In 1952, the English First Division was falling over itself to sign the most promising footballer the British Isles have ever produced. As a youth, he was 5 foot 11 inches tall, weighed 13 stone 7 pounds, with the chest of a blacksmith, legs like oak trees and a neck like Mike Tyson, and he got stronger and better as he got older. Over the years, there have been many comparisons made to Duncan, like Terry Venables, Kevin Beattie, Brian Robson, Frank Lampard and Steven Gerrard, but with respect, these players could not hold a candle to the boy from Dudley. Matt and Jimmy were trying to sign a promising England schoolboy international called Alec Farrell, who lived in Hoylake on the Wirral. Thanks to the football engrosser, they found a diamond. The football engrosser said to Matt and Jimmy, "There is a much better kid than Alec Farrell, and he's only 14, and he's the best of the present bunch of internationals. And if I'm any sort of judge of talent, he will be a world beater. His name is Duncan Edwards." Over the next next few weeks, Jimmy Murphy, Joe Armstrong and Bert Wally all watched the youngster that they knew he lived on the doorstep of their great rivals, Wolves. Matt met Duncan and his parents in the living room of their little house in Dudley, and Duncan said, "I'd give anything to play for your team, Mr. Busby." A few weeks later, Jimmy Murphy and Bert Wally turned up at Duncan's house at 3:30 in the morning, middle of the night, and knocked loudly on the door. After chatting to Gladstone and Sarah Edwards, Duncan wandered down the stairs in his pyjamas, wiping the sleep from his eyes, and signed. Jimmy said later, "What a signing, and in travelling expenses and meals Duncan must have cost us in the region of £100. How's that for the bargain of the century?" Duncan would become a magnificent footballer, but it was Jimmy Murphy who moulded him into a world-class player. Wolves were desperate to sign Duncan, and Stan Cullish used to wait for Duncan to come home from school every night to talk to him, and most of the First Division clubs were on high alert to sign Duncan. The FA Youth Challenge Cup introduced in 1952. The first ever game was against Leeds United and Jimmy was on top form. You're wearing the famous red shirt. Wear it with pride, keep it simple, plenty of movement, and don't forget, get bloody well stuck in. Duncan Edwards was made captain of the team, and he inspired a 4-0 thrashing with goals from Albert Scanlon, 2, David Pegg and a Jack Charlton own goal. For the record, only 5 Man United players won 3 Youth Cup medals. Coleman, Edwards and Charlton in 53, 54 and 55, and McGuinness and Hawksworth in 54, 55, 56. United would go on to win the first 5 FA Youth Cups. 1953 versus Wolves, 9-3. 1954 versus Wolves, 5-4. 1955 versus West Bromwich Albion, 7-1. 1956 versus Chesterfield, 4-3, and they had Gordon Banks in goal. 1957 versus West Ham, 8-2. Part 2 of the football's golden oldies from the Toll House in Lancaster. But for a twist of fate, the English Pelé could have been the most famous British footballer ever. During the 1950s, Jimmy was always talking about a lad from Doncaster with unique footballing skills, who he thought was to join their football academy. Jimmy said he was a dominating presence in the forward line, just as Duncan Edwards was at the halfback. Imagine having them in the same team. Then they discovered he had signed for Doncaster Rovers, managed by the great Peter Doherty. He made his debut at the age of 15 and played for England youth and amateur teams, age 16. The great Newcastle centre-forward Jackie Milburn said, "He's the greatest young player I've ever set eyes on," while Peter Doherty said, "I've no doubt in my mind he would have been the greatest goal scorer that England had ever seen." In October 1956, the young man had scored 15 goals in 17 games, and Matt started transfer talks. The youngster spent a week training at Old Trafford and loved every minute of it. His name was Alec Jeffrey, and Matt said, "I will come and sign you. You'll be a Manchester United player very, very soon." Matt sent a gift to the boy who had bad luck in abundance. Before the transfer could be finalised, Alec was selected to play for England in an under-23s game against France at Ashton Gate, Bristol. On a cold, wet, miserable winter's night, Alec broke his leg in 2 places, and this terrible injury more or less ended his career. A couple of years later, he attempted a comeback, but couldn't join Doncaster because they'd been paid £4,000 insurance money. So Alec joined Skegness Town. George Rayner, who managed Sweden in the 1958 World Cup, but broke his leg in the first game. 2 years in Australia, then he returned and signed for Doncaster, scoring 95 goals in 191 games. But then a tragic car accident where the club captain, John Nicholson, was killed and Alec was in a coma and laid up for many months. For all his setbacks and injuries, Alec was never bitter, saying, "Breaking my leg for England might have saved my life, because although it destroyed my potential and my transfer to Manchester United, I'd have probably been on that plane in Munich, so I have to be grateful." When Busby had given Alec some cash before the proposed transfer to buy his mother a nice gift, I believe Alec bought her a fridge. But after his injury, he rang Matt and said, "Mr. Busby, I need to give you the money back." Matt replied, "Keep the money, son, and send your mum my best wishes and those of Manchester United." Alec would top the league goal scorers in 1964-5 with 36 goals in the 4th Division at 26 years of age. He suffered a heart attack in Spain and died at the age of 61. Another world-class player plus the Loma. A true thoroughbred of the highest calibre, Bobby Charlton was touted as a star at schoolboy level, but he soon forgot those notions when he arrived at Old Trafford. When a schoolboy international joined the club, you might think he knew it all, but Jimmy Murphy and Bert Wally soon rid him of those ideas. Hour after hour, Jimmy would spend time with Bobby, who said Jimmy was a hard taskmaster, but a truly wonderful coach. One day Bobby shouted, "Why are you constantly having a go at me? I can't do anything right." Jimmy put his arm round Bobby's shoulder and said, "Bobby, son, there are a lot of very talented youngsters here. Some will make it, but a lot of them won't. But Bert, Matt and me believe you can become a great player, and that's why we spend so much time with you. So listen and learn." Bobby had a habit of sending long, spectacular passes from one side of the pitch to the other. They looked brilliant, but Jimmy would go to great lengths to say, if that pass was intercepted, United would be under pressure. Jimmy would say, "Play the shorter ball first, son." Once again, they spent hour after hour practicing until Bobby was exhausted, but he said it certainly helped him later in his career, and Jimmy's insistence that when you shoot, always hit the target, which is what he did against Mexico in the World Cup. In November 1956, United played Huddersfield in the FA Youth Cup away and won 4-2 after being 2-0 down, all because of a young terrier of a player they couldn't contain, Dennis Lowe. Busby immediately offered Andy Beattie, the Huddersfield manager, $10,000 for Lowe's signature, but he had to wait years before finally buying Dennis from Torino. First Division titles in 56 and 57. Could this team surpass Huddersfield and Arsenal's hat-trick of titles? I firmly believe that Manchester United would have won many championships and done the double, as well as making inroads into Europe. Real Madrid had great success in the European Cup, but these boys were more than capable of emulating them. This team had not reached their peak before they were decimated at Munich. Spud takes on another job. At the start of 1957, Wally Barnes resigned as Welsh manager, and Jimmy was offered and took the job on a part-time role, insisting involvement in selection, even though the Welsh FA committee was described as the butcher, the baker and the candlestick maker. The players idolised Jimmy. He would have a pint with them, a cigarette, and then get on the piano and play it beautifully. The Welsh FA's chairman was Milwyn Jenkins, a very sanctimonious man, and the secretary was Herbert Powell, a prudish bachelor who demanded the team sang hymns when travelling to or from a game. Wales could boast players like Jack Kelsey, Cliff Jones, John and Mel Charles, Ivor Allchurch, Ray Daniel, Derek Tapscott, Trevor Ford, Terry Medwin and Mel Hopkins. Jimmy would then attend FA meetings and sit there absolutely flabbergasted. They were pious, self-righteous and puritanical. Ray Daniel never played for Wales again after singing songs from Guys and Dolls on the team coach instead of hymns. Derek Tapscott was told to get a transfer from Arsenal to Cardiff, didn't do so and was dropped from the squad. Trevor Ford had written a book about his time at Sunderland and mentioned under-the-counter payments. He never played for Wales again. With these three players, it would have been more than possible for Wales to reach the semi-final or even final of the World Cup. What he meant to John Charles in his own words. When Jimmy became the Welsh team managers, the players didn't call him boss or gaffer, he was simply Jimmy. His first team meeting was a revelation. Normally players get bored listening to the manager, twittering on about marking space or playing in the hole and other such phrases, and some would fall asleep, pick their noses or read a book. Jimmy was absolutely brilliant, speaking passionately, and everyone was riveted to their seats, spellbound. The hairs on the back of my neck stood to attention. I had never heard a manager speak the way Jimmy spoke that night. After what seemed a matter of minutes, but was actually over an hour, he looked at his watch, apologised for keeping us so long and said, "When I get talking, I forget time. I'm sorry for boring you." The whole team and officials stood up and applauded him. Wales reached the quarter-finals in Sweden. Wales played Hungary 1-1, Mexico 1-1, Sweden 0-0, which put them into a playoff with Hungary, who they beat 2-1, then into the quarter-finals to play Brazil. Without the injured John Charles and Ray Daniel, Derek Tapscott and Trevor Ford, who had been cast aside, they lost 1-0 to a 68th minute goal from Pelé, and Brazil went on to be world champions. Jimmy was now a wanted man, being approached by Brazil to coach them on a salary of $30,000 a year. Juventus, through John Charles, offered him $20,000 to become manager, and Arsenal had offered him the manager's job before the World Cup. He turned them all down because his heart was at Old Trafford. Jimmy was always loyal to Manchester United. What a pity that wasn't a two-way street. Life was never the same for Spud after Munich. The day after the crash, Jimmy got off the train at London Road Station, now Piccadilly, jumped into a taxi and headed for Old Trafford to check if all the players were fit to play Wolves in 3 days' time. Rushing upstairs to his office, completely oblivious to everyone, Alma George, Matt's secretary, shouted him to stop before explaining everything that had happened. Jimmy's face was frozen. He couldn't grasp what Alma had told him, eventually walking to his office like a zombie, and at 47, the immediate destiny of this great club was in his hands. Once the news had sunk in, Jimmy was shaking and sobbing uncontrollably. It was a living nightmare. Those players and club officials were like close family to Jimmy, and it was 4 o'clock in the morning when he left Old Trafford for home, but he couldn't sleep and ended up drinking a bottle of whiskey as his mind wandered back to the first time he set eyes on those wonderful young men, now no longer in his care. He laughed, smiled and cried spasmodically. The following day, Jimmy flew out to Munich with Matt's wife Jean, daughter Sheena and son Sandy, and the wives and relatives of the injured. A gentle reminder of why Spud would cry every day for 31 years. Duncan Edwards' father Gladstone quit his job at the local factory and for the remainder of his life tended the graves in the churchyard where his beloved son was laid to rest. Duncan's mother died in 2003 and she tended his grave for 45 years and never saw it without flowers. Maybe friends, fans of United, or even just football lovers like me, he knew a very special young man. These are the players who tragically died at Munich. 8 superstars. Picking up the pieces after Munich. The United team that was shattered at Munich was no miracle. It was the cream of a soccer university that had risen to greatness after years of coaching by Jimmy and the others. The 5th round FA Cup game against Sheffield Wednesday was played in front of 62,000 fans, crying, laughing nervously and visibly drained that they'd created a wall of sound. If ever a game was won 3-0 on sheer willpower, this was the one. As a commentator up in the stands was talking to Dennis Weiler, Kenny Morgans, Albert Scanlon and Ray Wood in the ward of their hospital in Munich. The 6th round game was at the Hawthorns against West Brom, which ended 1-1, and many newspapers said the United fans were hysterical and teams playing United were under unfair pressure. Jimmy went wild saying, all we ask is to be allowed to play our own way and try to get to Wembley. The replay took place on March 5th with 61,000 fans packed into Old Trafford and 40,000 locked outside. The United players were particularly upset with the news that Duncan Edwards had succumbed to his injuries, but Bobby Charlton had a brilliant game, setting up the only goal in the 89th minute. Could they win the FA Cup? A semi-final against Fulham was played at Villa Park in front of 70,000 fans, who watched a masterclass from Bobby Charlton, who scored 2 left-foot beauties to end the game 2-2. The replay was played at Highbury on March 26, 1958, and United won a thriller 5-3. Jimmy never again had a full night's uninterrupted sleep. He was disconsolate and truly heartbroken as he sat in his armchair, poured himself a glass of whiskey and lost himself in his thoughts, thinking about the boys he loved, who he would never see again. When those players died, something in Jimmy Murphy died along with them. Bolton Wanderers would win the FA Cup 2-0 with 2 goals from Nat Lofthouse, and there was a great deal of discussion about the legality of his second goal. On their arrival back in Manchester, hundreds of thousands filled the route to Manchester Town Hall. Colin Webster said afterwards, Jimmy was our inspiration on that emotional and heartbreaking journey to Wembley in 1958. He was heartbroken, and many times I would see him on his own in the dressing room, sobbing his heart out. Tom Finney said, United have proved that real greatness means much more than a galaxy of star players. It means possessing a thing called team spirit. Behind it all is that incredible man, Jimmy Murphy. The 60s revolution. In 1958-59 they finished in second place to champions Wolves, but despite spending a relative fortune on players, Dennis Law, Noel Cantwell, Paddy Creran, Maurice Setters, Albert Quicksall, David Hurd and John Connelly, they suffered 4 difficult years, finishing 7th, 7th, 15th and 19th in 1963, but they won the FA Cup, beating Leicester 3-1, with Dennis Law playing a blinder. In 1963-64, United finished second to Liverpool, but things were coming together, although unlike the first 2 great teams they produced, this one cost over £350,000. 1964-65 saw the championship return to Old Trafford, followed by a 4th place finish in 65-66, before becoming champions again in 66-67. But Jimmy and Matt saw the European Cup as their main objective in memory of the boys who died at Munich. English football was changing dramatically and fast becoming a game where cheating, dissent, bad sportsmanship and trouble on the terraces was prevalent. Throughout the 50s, United fans had given the Reds loud, sustained vocal support with their rattles, bells and whistles without any malice or violent behaviour. By the end of this decade, chanting had gone from being supported to becoming increasingly abusive, and football hooliganism reared its ugly head. In 1959, Liverpool were looking for a new manager, so Chairman Tom Williams approached Jimmy Murphy, who turned him down. So Tom went for the second most passionate man in football, Bill Shankly. Culmination of a lifetime's work. It all came to fruition on that beautiful, momentous and sun-drenched evening on May 29, 1968, at Wembley in front of 92,225 fans, just over 10 years after the Munich air disaster. The team that beat Benfica 4-1 contained 8 home-reared players: Shea Brennan, Bill Foulkes, Nobby Stiles, George Best, Brian Kidd, Bobby Charlton, David Sadler and John Astor, although you could add Tony Dunn, who joined United at the age of 18. Every one of these players would tell you that they only succeeded as professional football players because of Jimmy Murphy, the Starmaker. Although the team had lifted the European Cup, the Holy Grail, I believe it was far from United's greatest ever team. Dennis Law was in St Joseph's Hospital undergoing an operation on the night. Jimmy was thrilled to bits that his little apples had won this historic and coveted trophy, and the unofficial man of the match was John Aston. A callous act for which Busby must accept responsibility. On September 30th, 1971, Jimmy officially retired from Old Trafford. He didn't want to retire, and it was a very sad ending to his 25-year stint at Manchester United. Eamon Dunphy wrote in his book that Jimmy was offered £25,000, equivalent to five years' salary as a settlement, and the scouting job on £25 a week, while Shea Brennan was given a free transfer and a pension for life. Yet there was no comparison in the service the two men had given to Manchester United. United suddenly stopped paying his taxi fare and his telephone bills, and Jimmy felt very sad, disenchanted and let down by Matt Busby. He was in limbo, both in his work and financially, when Matt blamed the board, but everyone knew that Matt was the board. Even though he was officially retired, Jimmy continued his daily pilgrimage to Old Trafford to collect his mail and speak to the scouts and staff. The dock arrives in December 1972. Tommy Docherty immediately brought back Jimmy to help with scouting, and he quickly found Steve Coppell and Gordon Hill, two brilliant wingers. Man United had been playing Crystal Palace at Selhurst Park, losing 5-0. And in the boardroom afterwards, Matt Busby offered Tommy Docherty the manager's job at Old Trafford. So this proves that Matt did not need to consult the directors about club decisions. His ruthless streak had not gone away, and he was entirely responsible for the disgraceful treatment handed out to Jimmy Murphy. Tommy said, "I never even watched Steve Coppell or Gordon Hill before signing them because Jimmy Murphy's word was good enough for me. In my opinion, he was as great as Matt Busby, who would not have been half the man without Jimmy Murphy." In 1981, Ron Atkinson took over from Dave Sexton, and he included Jimmy in everything, including trips abroad, because of his vast knowledge. When Ron was sacked, Alex Ferguson took over in November '86 and immediately re-established the famous youth system after talking to Spud Murphy. But sadly, Jimmy didn't live to see the successful 1990s when the class of '92 emerged, dying on November 14, 1989 at the age of 79. And the photos I will pass around now show why Jimmy cried every day for 31 years. From Desert Rat to Starmaker, Jimmy Murphy had a natural ability to inspire. Why? Because of his presence, his aura. The players did not want to let him down, and they struggled to explain this aura. It was an indefinable something, hard to explain. Maybe it was just an essential honesty and goodness, plus a lost quality called team spirit. Jimmy Murphy at United, 1946 to '89. Manager, 1958 after Munich. Assistant manager, 1955 to '71. Chief Scout, 1946 to '55. Reserve team manager, 1946 to '64. Full-time scout, 1946 to '69. Full-time scout, 1973 to 1977. Scouting office clerk, 1971 to '73. Part-time scout, 1977 to 1989. 43 years loyal service counted for nothing in the boardroom at Manchester United. They should hang their heads in shame. Manchester United would not be the club it is today without Jimmy Murphy. Jimmy Murphy, the Welshman with an Irish name, has been called the greatest football coach ever, and I wouldn't disagree with that point of view. From Duncan Edwards, Eddie Coleman, Liam Whelan, Tommy Taylor, Bobby Charlton and Dennis Violet, to George Best and Dennis Law, the quality and quantity of world-class footballers he coached is second to none. More than any other figure at Old Trafford in the post-war period, Jimmy Murphy stamped his personality on the club. The flair and passion with which United's best football is branded came from the dedication of this whiskey-swigging, firebrand soccer disciple. However, Murphy's vital role has been all too easily forgotten. This is the man, remember, who joined Manchester United when the ground was a shell of bombed wreckage and stayed loyal to the club despite lucrative offers from Arsenal, Juventus, Liverpool and the Brazilian national team. Final glimpse of the greatest coach. On the photograph on the left is Jimmy, Matt Busby and Bert Whalley with United's prolific post-war trophy haul. Above, Jimmy with Duncan Edwards, Liam Whelan centre and Dennis Violet back to the camera during training at the Cliff.